The morning of April 15th brought an unnatural stillness that seeped through the shattered windows and crumbling walls like poison gas. Greta Mueller pressed her palm against the cold stone floor of the cellar, feeling the absence of vibrations that had become her constant companion for 72 hours straight. The American artillery had been relentless, each explosion sending cascades of dust and small stones raining down on them from the ceiling, each impact making little Maria whimper and burrow deeper into the nest of threadbare blankets they'd assembled in the darkest corner. Now there was nothing. Just silence, heavy and oppressive, more terrifying than any bombardment, because silence meant decisions had been made, battles had been won or lost, and new soldiers would be walking through what remained of their town. Greta's hands trembled as she reached for the small pitcher of water they'd been rationing, offering it first to Maria, whose lips were cracked and bleeding, then to Hans, who took only the smallest sip before pushing it back toward his mother. 8 years old, and already he understood sacrifice. Already he'd learned to calculate survival in sips of dirty water and crumbs of mouldy bread. What kind of world taught children such mathematics? What kind of mother had she become, unable to provide even the most basic necessities while her babies slowly withered away in the darkness? Hans had been a robust child once, all energy and laughter, racing through the streets with the other boys, his cheeks flushed with exertion and joy. Now his collarbones jutted out like broken wings, his eyes too large for his gaunt face, his movements careful and calculated to conserve what little energy his starving body could produce. Maria, only 5, had nearly forgotten how to speak above a whisper. The loud, boisterous little girl who had driven Greta half-mad with constant chatter and questions had retreated into some internal space where words seemed unnecessary and dangerous. Greta crawled across the cellar floor to the narrow window that sat at street level, barely 6 inches high and hidden behind sandbags that someone, probably Herr Hoffman from the house next door, had stacked there before the American advance began. She'd heard his house take a direct hit 2 days ago, the explosion so massive it had knocked her off her feet and sent Maria into hysterics that lasted for hours. She doubted anyone in the Hoffman family had survived. Pressing her face against the grimy glass, she could see a slice of the street above, or what used to be a street. Now it was a wasteland of broken brick, twisted metal, shattered glass, and the occasional piece of furniture or personal item that looked obscene in its domesticity. A child's shoe, a framed photograph face down in the rubble, a teacup somehow miraculously intact amid the destruction. Nothing moved in her limited field of vision. No people, no vehicles, no animals, except for that orange tabby cat that seemed to have 9 lives, picking its way delicately through the debris as if it were simply inconvenienced by the apocalypse rather than traumatized by it. Greta envied that cat its composure, its ability to adapt and survive regardless of which army occupied the streets. Behind her, Hans stirred, and she heard the rustle of fabric as he shifted in their makeshift bed. His voice, when it came, was a dry whisper that barely carried across the small space. "They stopped shooting, Mama. Does that mean the war is over?" Greta wanted to tell him yes, wanted to promise that the nightmare was ending, that soon they would climb out of this hole and return to some semblance of normal life. But she'd learned the hard way that false hope was crueler than honest fear. "The shooting has stopped here," she said carefully, choosing each word with precision. "That means one army has won and another has lost. It means new soldiers will come soon." "American soldiers," Hans said, and there was something in his tone she couldn't quite identify. Fear, certainly, but also perhaps a thread of curiosity. The posters in town had called them demons, monsters who would destroy everything German, who would hurt children and burn homes and commit atrocities that made her stomach turn, just remembering the propaganda. But Greta had stopped believing in posters around the same time she'd stopped believing in victory, stopped believing that their leaders knew what they were doing, stopped believing that any of this senseless destruction served any purpose beyond feeding some madman's ego. She thought about Johann, her husband, dead on the Russian front after trying to desert. They'd shot him like a criminal, the letter had said. Shot him for the crime of wanting to live, wanting to come home to his wife and children rather than die in the frozen mud of a country he'd never wanted to invade in the first place. She'd burned her party card that night, watching the flames consume the swastika and all the lies it represented, feeling something hard and bitter take root in her chest where hope used to live. The rumble started low and distant, barely audible at first, more a vibration in the ground than an actual sound. Then it grew, building into the unmistakable growl of engines, multiple vehicles approaching in convoy formation. Greta's breath caught in her throat as the first vehicle rolled past her window, olive drab paint splattered with mud, white stars on the hood and sides marking it as American. She could see the bottom half of soldiers' legs as they passed, boots planted firmly on the metal floor of the truck bed, swaying slightly with the vehicle's movement over the uneven terrain. More vehicles followed, jeeps and trucks and larger transports, an endless stream of American military might rolling through what used to be the heart of their small town. And with each vehicle that passed, Greta felt her options narrowing, her control over her family's fate slipping away like water through her fingers. When the convoy finally stopped, she heard voices shouting in English, that strange, harsh language she'd never bothered to learn when learning it might have labelled her as suspicious, as possibly sympathetic to the enemy. Now she wished desperately that she understood what they were saying, what their plans were for the German civilians hiding in cellars throughout the town. The voices grew closer, and she could hear boots crunching on gravel and broken glass, hear the clink of metal equipment, hear laughter that sounded so normal, so human, that it sent a chill down her spine. These weren't the monsters from the posters. These were young men, tired men, men who laughed and complained, and probably wanted nothing more than to go home to their own families. She watched through the narrow window as 3 soldiers stopped near what used to be the town square, setting up a small cooking area with practiced efficiency. One of them produced a metal grate and set it over a hastily built fire. Another opened various cans and packages, ingredients that made Greta's stomach clench with violent hunger. The third soldier, younger than the other 2 with dark hair and a kind face, stood guard while smoking a cigarette, his rifle slung casually over his shoulder rather than held at the ready. The smell hit her like a physical force. Real food, cooking food, the rich, complex aroma of meat and vegetables and spices she couldn't identify, smells she'd nearly forgotten existed after months of turnip soup and stale bread that was more sawdust than wheat. Her mouth flooded with saliva so quickly she had to swallow hard to keep from gagging. Behind her, she heard Hans whimper, a sound of such desperate longing that it broke her heart all over again. "Mama," he breathed, his voice cracking. "I can smell it. Real food." "Stay here," Greta commanded, putting every ounce of authority she could muster into her voice. "Stay hidden. Stay quiet. We don't know yet if they're safe." But Hans was already moving, his skeletal frame pulling itself upright with determination that terrified her. 8 years old and so thin she could count every vertebra in his spine through his torn shirt, and he was standing up, swaying dangerously on legs that had grown weak from malnutrition and lack of use. "Hans, no!" she hissed, reaching for him, but he was already climbing the cellar stairs, drawn by the smell of food the way drowning men are drawn to the surface, beyond reason, beyond caution, driven by pure biological need. Greta's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched her son push open the cellar door and stumble into the harsh morning light. Every instinct screamed at her to run after him, to drag him back to safety, to shield his body with her own if the Americans decided to shoot first and ask questions later. But her legs felt frozen, turned to stone by the terrible weight of impossible choices. If she revealed herself, they might shoot both of them. If she stayed hidden, she might have to watch her son die while Maria clung to her in the darkness below. What kind of choice was that for a mother to make? What kind of world forced such decisions? Through the window, she watched Hans emerge fully onto the street, blinking in the sunlight that must have seemed blinding after so many weeks in the dim cellar. He looked like something from a nightmare, pale as a ghost, clothes hanging off his frame in rags, his hair matted and filthy, his movements jerky and uncertain. A ghost child, she thought wildly. That's what her beautiful boy had become. A ghost haunting the ruins of the life they'd once known. 50 meters away, near the cooking fire, one of the American soldiers noticed him. The dark-haired one, the young one who'd been smoking. He said something sharp to his companions, pointing toward Hans, and all 3 soldiers turned to stare at the German boy swaying in the middle of the destroyed street. This was it, Greta thought, her hands gripping the windowsill so hard her knuckles went white. This was the moment when the propaganda would prove true or false, when she would learn whether Americans were the monsters they'd been warned about, or simply men who'd been fighting too long and seen too much death. The dark-haired soldier lowered his rifle, setting it carefully against a pile of rubble. Then he stood slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening, and said something in a gentle voice that carried across the space between him and Hans. The words were incomprehensible to Greta, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the voice someone used with a frightened animal or a traumatized child. The soldier reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a rectangular brown package. Even from her limited vantage point, Greta recognized it. A Hershey's bar. American chocolate. Something she hadn't seen in years, something that had become almost mythical in its scarcity. The soldier held it out toward Hans, his hand steady, his expression soft with something that looked remarkably like compassion. And Hans, her brave, reckless, starving son, took a tentative step forward. Then another. Then another. His small hand reached out, trembling violently, pulled back as if expecting a trap, then reached out again with the desperate hope of a child who had known too much suffering and too little kindness. When Hans's fingers finally closed around the chocolate bar, Greta saw her son's face crumple. Tears started tracking down the dirt on his cheeks, carving clean lines through the grime, and even from this distance she could see his lips moving, forming words she couldn't hear but could guess. "Thank you." In German, or in broken English, or in the universal language of gratitude that transcended national boundaries. And in that moment, watching her son accept food from the hands of an enemy soldier who chose mercy over indifference, Greta felt something shift inside her chest. Something that had been locked away since Johann's death, since the bombs started falling, since the world became a place where neighbours disappeared in the night and children learned to hide in the dark and be afraid of their own shadows. Something she'd thought was dead forever, carefully buried beneath layers of survival instinct and cynical pragmatism. It felt dangerous and fragile and impossibly precious. It felt like hope. But hope was a luxury they couldn't afford. Not yet. Maybe not ever. So Greta gathered what remained of her courage, checked to make sure Maria was still sleeping in the corner, and climbed the cellar stairs to face whatever came next. If the Americans were going to shoot someone, better her than Hans, better her than Maria. She'd failed them in so many ways already. At least she could shield them with her body if necessary. The morning light felt harsh and unforgiving after so long in the dimness below. Greta squinted against the brightness, raising one hand to shade her eyes while the other automatically smoothed down her dress, a futile gesture of dignity in the face of absolute degradation. The dress was filthy, torn in several places, patched and repatched until more of it was repair work than original fabric. Her hair hung limp and greasy, her hands were crusted with dirt, and she probably smelled terrible, though she'd long since stopped being able to detect her own odour. The American soldiers turned to watch her approach, their hands moving to their weapons but not quite drawing them. She raised both her hands slowly, palms out, the universal gesture of surrender, of peace, of please. "Don't shoot me, I'm not a threat." Hans stood between her and the soldiers, chocolate smeared across his mouth, his eyes wide with a mixture of joy and terror, torn between the instinct to run to his mother and the desperate need to protect his precious treasure. "Hans," she called softly, keeping her voice level despite the fear hammering in her chest. "In German," she said, "it's all right. Come to me slowly. Don't run. Don't make any sudden movements." The dark-haired soldier who'd given Hans the chocolate took a step forward, and Greta's muscles tensed, preparing to throw herself between him and her son. But he simply held up one hand in a calming gesture, then pointed to himself and said clearly, "Eddie. Eddie Kowalski." His pronunciation was strange, foreign, but Greta had heard enough Polish names in her life to recognize the Eastern European roots. Kowalski, a Polish name, which meant this American soldier came from immigrant stock, possibly from a family that had fled the very wars and pogroms that had carved up Europe long before the current madness. She pointed to herself, fighting to remember the English words she'd learned in school decades ago, when the world had seemed so much simpler and learning English had been about opportunity rather than survival. "Greta," she managed. "Greta Müller." Then she pointed to Hans and added, "Mein Sohn, my son." Eddie nodded, seeming to understand, and said something that included the word safe. He gestured toward the cooking fire, toward the food, and Greta's stomach twisted with such violent hunger she nearly doubled over. When had she last eaten? 2 days ago? 3? Time had become fluid in the cellar, marked only by the rhythm of artillery fire and the slow gnawing of starvation in her belly. One of the other soldiers, a man with kind eyes and sergeant stripes on his sleeve, stepped forward and spoke in what sounded like Spanish-accented English. His gestures made his meaning clear, even when his words didn't. Food. They were offering food. Pride warred with desperation in Greta's chest. She wanted to refuse, wanted to tell them she didn't need charity from the army that had destroyed her town, that had killed her neighbors, that represented everything that had gone wrong with the world. But Maria was still in the cellar, too weak now to even climb the stairs, and Hans was staring at that cooking pot with eyes that held nothing but hunger. And what was pride worth when your children were starving? She nodded once, sharply, then gestured toward the cellar entrance. "Maria," she said, hoping they would understand. "Kleine Mädchen, little girl, another child." Eddie's expression shifted immediately, concern replacing caution. He said something to the sergeant, who nodded and ladled stew into 2 metal mess kits. Eddie approached Greta slowly, offering her one of the kits with both hands, as if presenting a gift rather than rations. The smell made her dizzy with longing. Real meat, real vegetables, spices she couldn't identify but that triggered memories of better days, of family dinners around a full table, of life before everything fell apart. "Danke," she whispered, accepting the bowl with hands that shook so badly she nearly dropped it. "Thank you. Thank you. Thank you." Eddie handed the second bowl to Hans, who clutched it like the precious treasure it was, his fingers tight around the metal, as if afraid someone might try to take it away. Then Eddie gestured toward the cellar, raising his eyebrows in question. He wanted to see Maria, Greta realized. Wanted to make sure the other child was real, that this wasn't some elaborate German trick. She couldn't blame him for that caution. She wouldn't have trusted her either. Greta led the way back down into the cellar, acutely aware of Eddie following behind her, of his presence in their small space of refuge and desperation. The cellar looked even worse, seeing it through a stranger's eyes. The piles of dirty blankets, the bucket they used for waste, the small pile of mouldy bread crusts and rotten turnips that represented their entire food supply, the walls streaked with moisture and mould, the pervasive smell of human misery and slow decay. Maria lay curled in the corner exactly where Greta had left her, so still that for one terrible moment Greta thought the worst had happened. Then the little girl stirred, her eyes opening to take in the strange soldier standing in their cellar, and her face crumpled with terror. She tried to scream, but managed only a hoarse whimper, scrambling backward until her back hit the wall and she could retreat no further. Eddie immediately stepped back, raising both hands to show he meant no harm. He said something soft in English, then pulled another chocolate bar from his pocket and set it carefully on the ground before backing toward the stairs. The message was clear. He wasn't a threat. He was offering food, not violence, help, not harm. Greta gathered Maria into her arms, feeling the child's rapid heartbeat against her chest, feeling every rib and every vertebra through the thin fabric of Maria's dress. She whispered reassurances in German, nonsense words about safety and kindness and how everything would be all right, lies that mothers told their children to make the unbearable bearable. She fed Maria first, tiny, careful spoonfuls of stew, making sure the little girl didn't eat too quickly and make herself sick. Hans hovered nearby, already halfway through his own portion, eating with single-minded focus that would have been funny in different circumstances. Every few bites he would pause and say something to his sister, sharing his joy at the taste of real food, describing flavors she needed to hurry up and experience. By the time both children had finished eating, Eddie had returned to the street above, giving them privacy for this small moment of humanity. But Greta could see his shadow at the top of the cellar stairs, standing guard, protecting them from the other soldiers who might not be so understanding, might not be so kind. That first night after the Americans arrived, Greta lay awake in the darkness, listening to her children breathe. Real breathing, not the shallow gasps of starvation. Full breathing, fed breathing. Hans clutched the empty chocolate wrapper like a talisman, and Maria had finally spoken above a whisper, asking in a tiny voice if the nice soldier would come back tomorrow with more food. Greta didn't know how to answer that. She didn't know if Eddie's kindness was an anomaly or a pattern, didn't know if tomorrow would bring more mercy or would reveal that today had been nothing but a brief reprieve before whatever came next. So she simply said maybe, and held her children close and tried not to think about all the ways the world could still hurt them. Private Eddie Kowalski sat by the dying fire long after the other men had turned in for the night, staring at the empty mess kit he'd given to the German boy and trying to reconcile what he'd seen today with everything he'd been taught about the enemy. For 3 years, the army had drilled into him that Germans were the adversary, the force they needed to defeat, the people responsible for this entire catastrophic war. And that was true in a way. But it was also incomplete, a story that left out crucial chapters about the difference between governments and people, between those who made wars and those who suffered them. The boy's face kept flashing through his mind. That skeletal frame, those enormous eyes, that desperate reaching for the chocolate bar as if it were salvation itself. Eddie had seen that expression before, though not on German faces. He'd seen it in his grandmother's old photographs, in the haunted looks of immigrants arriving at Ellis Island, in the faces of his own relatives who'd fled Poland with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the hope that America might offer them a chance at survival. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory, thick with her Polish accent that never quite disappeared despite decades in Detroit. "You feed hungry people, Eddie. You don't ask them where they come from first. You don't check their papers. You just feed them, because that's what separates humans from animals. That's what makes us worthy of the life God gave us." She'd told him stories about hiding from pogroms, about the German family who'd risked their own lives to shelter her in their cellar, sharing their bread when they barely had enough for themselves. She'd never learned what happened to them, had spent decades wondering if they'd survived the wars that followed, if they'd escaped the bombs and the chaos, or if they'd become casualties of the very cycles of violence they'd tried to resist. What happened to that German family, Babsia? Eddie had asked her once when he was maybe 10 years old, sitting in her kitchen while she made pierogi and told stories of the old country. "I don't know, Kochani," she'd answered, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she sealed each dumpling. "I had to run, had to escape to America before they came for me too. But I think of them often. I pray for them. I hope that somewhere, someone showed them the same kindness they showed me. I hope their children didn't go hungry." Now here was Eddie, on the other side of the world, on the other side of a different war, facing German children who looked exactly like the starving Polish children his grandmother had described. History repeating itself in an endless loop of suffering and displacement, of children paying for the sins of adults who couldn't seem to learn that hatred only bred more hatred. Corporal Flynn emerged from one of the tents, unable to sleep, and settled down beside Eddie with a cigarette dangling from his lips. "You gone soft on the enemy, Kowalski?" he asked, but there was no real bite in his voice, just tired curiosity. "They're kids, Flynn," Eddie replied, not looking away from the fire. "Starving kids. When did kids become the enemy?" Flynn was quiet for a moment, drawing on his cigarette and exhaling smoke into the night sky. "My old man used to say the same thing," he said finally. "He fought in the First War in France. Said the worst part wasn't fighting the German soldiers, it was seeing the French children begging for food after towns got shelled. Said they all looked the same when they were hungry. Didn't matter if they were French or German or American, just hungry kids." Eddie nodded, grateful for the understanding. He'd expected pushback, expected to be called a traitor or a sympathizer or worse. But Flynn had seen enough of war to know that the lines between good and evil weren't as clear as the generals liked to pretend. The next morning brought a soft rain that turned the rubble-strewn streets into rivers of mud and debris. Eddie was checking the supply inventory when he heard a small voice call out in heavily accented English. "Mr. Eddie? Mr. Eddie?" He turned to find Hans standing at the edge of their camp, holding something wrapped in a dirty handkerchief. The boy approached slowly, still wary despite yesterday's kindness, and held out the package with both hands. "Furder," he said carefully, pronouncing the German word with exaggerated precision. "Für Sheila, for you." Eddie unwrapped the handkerchief to find 3 smooth stones, polished until they gleamed despite their time in the rubble. He recognized them as the kind of river stones kids collected, treasured for their beauty and smoothness, kept in pockets as good luck charms or traded with friends. Hans had given him his most precious possessions, the things he'd probably been carrying when the bombs started falling, the last remnants of childhood before war turned children into survival machines. "Thank you, Hans," Eddie said, his throat tight with emotion. "These are beautiful." He made a show of examining each stone carefully, holding them up to catch the weak morning light, treating them with the reverence they deserved. Hans beamed, his whole face transforming with pride and pleasure, looking for just a moment like the carefree child he should have been allowed to be. Over the following days, their unlikely friendship deepened. Hans appeared each morning, helping Eddie with small tasks, learning English words with the quick facility of the young, teaching Eddie German phrases in return. The boy was bright, curious, full of questions about America and what it was like there, whether they had bombings and rations and soldiers in every street. "No bombings," Eddie told him, trying to imagine his hometown through Hans's eyes. "In America, children go to school and play baseball and eat ice cream in the summer. Their fathers come home from work every evening and their mothers cook dinner and everyone sits around the table together." Hans listened to these descriptions with the intensity of someone hearing fairy tales about a magical kingdom. "That sounds nice," he said wistfully. "Maybe someday Germany can be like that again, when the war is finished and everyone stops fighting." Eddie didn't have the heart to tell him that even after wars ended, the scars remained for generations, that the trauma seeded into children's bones during these terrible years would shape them for the rest of their lives. Instead, he just ruffled Hans's hair and said, "Maybe so, kid. Maybe so." Greta watched these interactions from a distance, still wary, but gradually relaxing her guard. Eddie noticed that she'd started doing small tasks around the camp, mending torn uniforms with thread she'd somehow salvaged, organizing medical supplies for Dr. Patterson with careful efficiency. She never asked for payment, but Eddie made sure extra rations found their way to her family's cellar, and Sergeant Martinez started sharing his cigarettes with her during the evening hours when the day's work was done and everyone needed a moment to breathe. She told them, bit by bit, about her life before the war. About Johann, her husband, who'd been a schoolteacher before being conscripted. About their small house with a garden where she'd grown vegetables and flowers, where Hans and Maria had played in the sunshine while she hung laundry and sang old songs her own mother had taught her. About the slow transformation of their town as neighbours began disappearing, as conversations became dangerous, as fear became the only reliable constant in their daily existence. "My neighbour," she said one evening in halting English, was hiding Jewish family in his attic, the Kowalczyks. I knew they were there. I could hear the children sometimes, playing very quiet. Then one night, trucks came. Took them all away, all of them. The Kowalczyks, my neighbour, everyone. "What did you do?" Martinez asked gently. "Nothing," Greta said, and the self-loathing in her voice was painful to hear. "I did nothing. I was too afraid for my own children. I told myself there was nothing I could do, that trying to help would just get my family killed too. But doing nothing, that killed something inside me, something I don't think will ever come back." Eddie found himself sharing his own family history in return, telling her about his grandmother's escape from Poland, about the German family who'd hidden her and saved her life. When he mentioned the name of the town where his grandmother had lived, Greta's eyes widened with recognition. "That's only 30 kilometers from here," she said. "Maybe your grandmother's family and my family. Maybe we are neighbors, in a way, before all this madness." The thought sent a chill down Eddie's spine. How many other connections like this existed, invisible threads linking people across borders and languages, relationships that could have flourished in peacetime but had been severed by the arbitrary lines drawn by men who'd never had to do their own fighting. How many potential friends had become enemies simply because politicians decided it should be so. Little Maria, encouraged by her brother's growing confidence, began emerging from the cellar more frequently. She was a tiny thing, all bones and huge eyes, but Eddie could see hints of the personality that must have existed before hunger and fear had forced it into hibernation. She loved singing, he discovered, and would hum little German lullabies while helping her mother sort through salvaged supplies. One afternoon, Doc Patterson carved her a small wooden doll from a piece of scrap lumber, giving it a simple face and dress carved into the wood. Maria's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. She clutched the doll to her chest and burst into tears. Not sad tears, but the overwhelmed crying of someone who'd forgotten that people could be kind for no reason, that gifts existed, that the world could still contain moments of pure, unexpected joy. "What do you say, Maria?" Greta prompted gently. "Thank you," Maria whispered in careful English, the words clearly practiced. "Thank you, Mr. Doc." Patterson cleared his throat roughly, clearly fighting his own emotions. "You're welcome, little miss. You take good care of her, all right?" From that day forward, Maria was rarely seen without her doll, which she named Anna after a cousin who'd died in a bombing. She would have long, serious conversations with Anna in whispered German, describing the nice Americans and the food they shared, and how maybe, just maybe, things were going to be all right after all. Private Johnson from Alabama, who'd initially been the most hostile to Eddie's fraternization with enemy civilians, surprised everyone by starting to teach Hans simple English phrases during his guard shifts. He claimed it was just practical, that Hans could be useful as a translator if they needed to communicate with other German civilians. But Eddie saw the way Johnson's expression softened when Hans successfully learned a new word, the way he'd slip the boy extra portions when he thought no one was watching. Even Corporal Flynn, cynical Flynn who trusted no one and believed in nothing except getting home alive, started setting aside portions of his rations. Not much, just a little extra bread here, an apple there, claiming he wasn't hungry when everyone knew he was just as hungry as the rest of them, just less willing to eat while children starved. The Americans had become accidental guardians, Eddie realized. They'd stumbled into this role not through any official policy, but through the simple human inability to watch children suffer when you had the power to prevent it. Regulations said one thing, but regulations had been written by people who'd never looked into the eyes of an 8-year-old clutching an empty chocolate wrapper like it was the most precious thing in the world. Eddie wrote long letters home to his mother, describing the German family they'd essentially adopted, trying to explain the strange cognitive dissonance of being a soldier in enemy territory while simultaneously developing genuine affection for the people they'd been taught to hate. His mother's response, when it finally arrived via military post, was unequivocal. "Your babcia would be proud of you," she wrote in her careful Polish-inflected English. She always said that the war is between the men who give orders, not between the people who suffer them. Feed them, Eddie. Feed them like she was fed. This is how we break the cycles. This is how we remember that before we are German or American or Polish, we are human beings. And human beings take care of the children. Always the children first. He read that letter to Greta one evening, translating the Polish words into English and then helping her understand the English with his broken German. She listened with tears streaming down her face, and when he finished, she said simply, "Your grandmother? She is wise woman. I would like to meet her someday. To say thank you." "Maybe you will," Eddie said, though they both knew it was unlikely. The war had ripped too many holes in the fabric of the world for such neat reunions. But it was nice to imagine, nice to picture a future where Greta and his grandmother could sit together over tea, sharing their stories of survival and loss, finding common ground in their experiences of being mothers in a world that seemed determined to destroy their children. Those golden days of late April felt suspended outside of time, a brief pocket of peace and normalcy amid the ongoing chaos of war. The weather warmed, spring flowers began pushing up through the rubble in defiant displays of life's persistence, and Hans started laughing again, real laughter that rang through the ruined streets and made everyone smile despite themselves. Maria progressed from whispers to normal speaking volume, her voice high and clear as she chatted about Anna and the Americans and whether they might stay forever. Greta's face lost some of its gauntness. Her movements became less careful, less calculated, and Eddie even caught her smiling once or twice when Hans told particularly terrible jokes he'd learned from the soldiers. It felt possible during those weeks to imagine that humanity might actually be stronger than hatred, that the bonds formed between people could transcend the artificial divisions created by borders and ideologies. Eddie began to think that maybe, just maybe, they were building something important here, something that could be a model for how the world might work when the fighting finally stopped. He should have known better. In war, every moment of hope is just waiting to be shattered by the next wave of reality. Lieutenant Blake arrived on a Monday morning that started like any other, with Hans helping Eddie clean rifles while Maria sang softly to her doll and Greta worked on mending a torn tent panel. No one noticed the pristine jeep until it was too late, until Blake had already stepped out with his clipboard and his pressed uniform and his determination to restore proper military discipline to what he clearly viewed as a circus of regulatory violations. The transformation was immediate and brutal. Within minutes, Blake had assembled the men into formation, his voice sharp with authority and disapproval as he outlined the new policies. No fraternization with German nationals, no sharing of military supplies, no aid to enemy civilians beyond what was strictly mandated by international law. And Eddie, the primary offender, was being reassigned effective immediately, transferred to convoy duty where he wouldn't have the opportunity to continue his inappropriate relationship with enemy combatants. Eddie tried to argue, tried to explain that these weren't combatants but victims, that feeding starving children didn't undermine military objectives but rather demonstrated the values they were supposedly fighting to defend. Blake shut him down with bureaucratic efficiency, quoting regulations and chain of command and the need for proper professional distance from the enemy population. The worst part was watching Hans witness the confrontation from the cellar window. Eddie could see the boy's face, could see the exact moment when understanding dawned, when Hans realized that the nice soldier who'd given him chocolate and taught him English and treated him like a human being was being forced to leave. The betrayal in Hans's expression was worse than any wound Eddie had taken in combat. He tried to say goodbye, tried to explain to Greta and the children that this wasn't his choice, that he would stay if he could, that leaving them felt like the worst kind of abandonment. But what could he say that would make it better? How could he explain to an 8-year-old that adults had to follow orders, even when those orders were cruel and wrong? "Hans," Eddie said, kneeling down to the boy's level while Blake watched with obvious impatience. "I have to go now, but that doesn't mean I'm forgetting you. I'll never forget you. You understand?" Hans stared at him with eyes that had gone flat and dead again, all the light drained out of them by this fresh betrayal. "Mama was right," he said in English that was almost perfect now. "She said you would leave. She said all soldiers leave. I should have listened." The words cut deeper than any knife. Eddie wanted to protest, wanted to insist that he was different, that he cared, that this wasn't like the other abandonments Hans had experienced. But what difference did intent make when the result was the same? He was leaving. That was the only fact that mattered to a child who'd already lost too much. Greta appeared at the cellar entrance, her face carefully blank, and Eddie recognized that expression immediately. It was the face of someone who'd been disappointed too many times to be surprised anymore. Someone who'd built walls around their heart and locked the gates and thrown away the key. The woman who'd started to trust him, started to hope, was gone. In her place stood the suspicious survivor they'd first met, the one who knew better than to believe in temporary kindness. "You go now," she said in English, her voice flat. "Is better this way. We survive before you. We survive after you. Don't need American pity." It wasn't true, and they both knew it, but what else could she say? Pride was sometimes the only thing left when everything else had been stripped away. And Eddie understood that she was trying to protect her children from further emotional damage by pretending this had never mattered, that his presence had been a convenience rather than a connection. He gathered his belongings in numb silence, stuffing his duffel bag with the possessions that suddenly felt meaningless. His grandmother's letters, the smooth stones Hans had given him, a photograph of his family back in Detroit. These things that were supposed to anchor him to who he was and what he stood for felt like hollow mockeries in the face of what he was being forced to do. The convoy departed at dawn the next morning, a line of trucks rolling through the grey pre-dawn light while fog clung to the ruined streets like ghosts. Eddie sat in the back of a transport truck, watching through the canvas opening as their temporary camp grew smaller and finally disappeared from view. The last thing he saw was a small figure standing at the cellar window, holding an empty chocolate wrapper and not waving goodbye. For 3 weeks, Eddie moved through his new duties like a machine, performing tasks with mechanical efficiency while feeling absolutely nothing. He distributed supplies, drove convoy routes, stood guard duty, all without engaging emotionally with anything happening around him. The other soldiers left him alone, recognizing the signs of someone processing trauma in the only way available in wartime. You didn't talk about it, you just moved forward and hoped the numbness eventually wore off. But at night, lying in whatever bunk or foxhole had been assigned to him, Eddie couldn't stop thinking about Hans and Maria and Greta. Couldn't stop wondering if they were getting enough to eat now that his rations weren't supplementing their intake. Couldn't stop imagining Hans going back to that starved, hollow look, Maria retreating into silence again, Greta's face hardening further as she learned for the 1000th time that hope was dangerous and trust was a luxury only fools could afford. He wrote letters he knew he couldn't send because he didn't have an address, and even if he did, fraternizing with enemy civilians was still forbidden. Pages and pages of apologies, explanations, stories about his grandmother and why he'd tried to help them and how sorry he was for leaving. He burned most of them, watching the paper curl and blacken in campfires, but kept one letter tucked inside his jacket pocket like a talisman. "Someday," he told himself. "Someday when this is all over, I'll find them again and I'll deliver this letter and I'll make them understand that I never wanted to go." It was his mother's letter that finally broke through the numbness. It arrived on a Tuesday, carried by the same supply convoy that brought fresh rations and ammunition and orders for the next advance. Eddie opened it, expecting the usual maternal concern, updates about his siblings and neighborhood gossip and reminders to stay safe. Instead, he found something that hit him like a physical blow. "I spoke with your grandmother," his mother wrote. "I told her about the German family you tried to help, about how you were reassigned for breaking regulations." "Eddie," she cried. She actually cried, which I have never seen her do. She said you are doing her work, carrying on her legacy of remembering that children are children, regardless of what flag flies over their heads. She dictated something she wants me to send to you, and she made me promise you would read it. The next paragraph was in his grandmother's own handwriting, shaky but determined. "My dearest Eddie," she wrote in Polish, "you are doing what I always hoped you would do. You are remembering that we are human beings first, before we are anything else. The German family who saved me during the pogroms, they were just people. Good people who saw someone in need and helped, even though helping put them in danger. I never forgot them. I think of them every day. And now you have met your own family in need, and you helped them, and that makes this old woman's heart glad, even as it breaks for what you had to endure. But Eddie," she continued, her handwriting growing shakier as emotion overtook her. "This is not finished. You must go back. You must find them again. Rules and regulations are made by men who sit in offices and never see the consequences of their decisions. But you have seen. You know what matters, so you go back when you can, and you feed them again, and you tell them that this is what humanity looks like. This is what resistance to hatred looks like. Not grand gestures, but small kindnesses repeated until they become strong enough to crack the walls of bitterness." Eddie read that letter 17 times, memorizing every word, letting his grandmother's convictions seep into his bones and reawaken something that had gone dormant under the weight of military discipline and bureaucratic indifference. She was right. Of course she was right. He'd known it all along, but had needed permission to believe it. Needed someone with authority, even if that authority was just a Polish grandmother who'd survived pogroms and poverty and immigration through sheer stubborn refusal to let hatred win. The question was how to get back. His new assignment kept him 40 miles away from the town where Greta and her children were struggling to survive. He had no leave time, no legitimate reason to be anywhere near that sector. Any attempt to visit would be blatant insubordination, potentially earning him everything from a reprimand to a court-martial depending on how seriously Blake wanted to push the issue. But Eddie had learned something important during his weeks with Hans and Maria. He'd learned that sometimes the right thing to do was also the forbidden thing, and that following your conscience meant being willing to accept the consequences even when those consequences were severe. His grandmother had risked her life to survive. The German family who'd hidden her had risked their lives to help. Johann had risked his life trying to desert rather than keep fighting in a war he knew was wrong. Greta risked her life every day trying to keep her children alive in a world that seemed determined to punish them for the crime of being born German. What was Eddie risking? A military career he didn't particularly want? A promotion he'd never sought? The good opinion of officers who thought regulations mattered more than human lives? When he looked at it that way, the choice became absurdly simple. It took 2 weeks of careful planning and calling in favors from sympathetic soldiers to arrange a convoy route that would take him within walking distance of the town. He traded his cigarette rations for gasoline, bartered his extra socks for a jerry can he could strap to his back, promised Private Johnson he'd bring back some of the German coffee that was supposedly better than the American stuff they'd been drinking. He was burning every bridge and cashing in every chip he had, but it felt right in a way that following orders had never felt. The night before his unauthorized return, Eddie sat down and wrote one more letter to his grandmother. This time he knew he'd send it, because if he didn't make it back from this particular act of insubordination, someone needed to know why he'd done it and what he'd been trying to accomplish. "Dear Babsia," he wrote, "I'm going back to help them. I don't know if I'll be able to make any real difference, and I don't know what will happen when the army figures out what I've done. But I keep thinking about what you told me, about how resistance isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just showing up when you said you would. Sometimes it's keeping promises when everyone else has walked away. Sometimes it's choosing to be human when the world is trying to turn everyone into machines. If this goes badly, he continued, please don't think I was foolish. Think that I was trying to honor what you taught me, trying to be the kind of man who doesn't abandon children just because regulations say I should. And if you ever get the chance, if you ever somehow manage to find them, please tell Greta and Hans and Maria that I meant every kindness, that leaving wasn't my choice, and that coming back was the easiest decision I ever made. He signed it simply. Your loving grandson, Eddie, sealed it in an envelope addressed to his mother's house in Detroit, and left it with his few possessions in case he didn't return. Then he took his jerry can of gasoline, his backpack full of liberated rations, and his determination to prove that humanity was stronger than bureaucracy, and he started walking through the German countryside under cover of darkness, navigating by stars and memory and the desperate hope that he wasn't already too late. Greta woke that morning to silence once again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. Not the terrifying absence of artillery, but the heavy quiet of resignation and defeat. 3 weeks since Eddie had left, since the Americans had stopped sharing their rations, since Lieutenant Blake had established his new regime of proper military distance and appropriate allocation of resources. They were dying again, slowly but surely. The meagre supplies she'd managed to salvage weren't enough to sustain 3 people. Hans had started giving most of his portions to Maria, and Greta had started giving most of hers to Hans, and the mathematics of starvation had reasserted itself with inevitable cruelty. But worse than the hunger was the silence. Hans had stopped talking almost entirely, retreating into the same internal space he'd inhabited before Eddie's arrival. Maria had gone back to whispers, clutching her wooden doll and telling Anna stories about the nice soldiers who used to bring chocolate but had left, because that's what soldiers always did. And Greta had felt the last remnants of hope die in her chest, calcifying into bitter acceptance that this was simply how the world worked. People showed you kindness as a temporary respite, then took it away once they got bored or inconvenienced or reminded by their superiors that compassion wasn't covered in the regulations. She couldn't even be angry about it. Anger required energy she no longer had. Instead, she just felt tired, bone-deep exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical hunger and everything to do with the crushing weight of trying to keep her children alive in a world that seemed actively hostile to their survival. The decision came to her in the grey hour before dawn, the same time of day when all terrible decisions seemed to make sense. They couldn't survive in the cellar anymore. The food was gone, the water was running low, and Maria's cough had returned with a vengeance, a wet racking sound that kept all of them awake at night and made Greta think about tuberculosis and pneumonia and all the ways children died when they lacked adequate shelter and nutrition and medical care. So they would surrender themselves to the Americans, not to Eddie, who was gone, but to whoever was in charge now. Maybe they would be sent to a prison camp. Maybe they would be sent somewhere else. But at least in an American facility there would be food, perhaps medical attention for Maria, perhaps a chance for Hans to be a child again instead of a tiny adult bearing the weight of impossible choices. She dressed the children in their least dirty clothes, braided Maria's hair with fingers that shook only slightly, and picked up the wooden doll that had become Maria's most precious possession. This would be the last decision she would make for her family. After this, their fate would be in American hands, for better or worse, and at least she wouldn't have to watch them slowly starve in the darkness anymore. The walk to the American checkpoint felt endless, though it was barely a quarter mile. Every step required conscious effort, her muscles weak from malnutrition and her spirit weaker still from the accumulated trauma of months living in constant fear. Hans held Maria's hand with gentle firmness, helping his little sister navigate the rubble-strewn street, murmuring encouragement when she stumbled. The checkpoint appeared through the morning fog like something from a nightmare. Barbed wire, sandbags, armed soldiers watching their approach with expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion. Greta opened her mouth to deliver her carefully rehearsed speech in broken English, to surrender herself and her children to whatever fate awaited them. But before she could speak, a familiar voice called out from behind them, hoarse and breathless and more beautiful than any sound she'd ever heard. "Mrs. Müller? Hans? Wait!" She turned, hardly daring to believe, and saw Eddie Kowalski stumbling toward them through the rubble. He looked terrible, filthy and exhausted, his uniform torn and his face haggard, a jerry can strapped to his back and a bulging backpack threatening to pull him off balance. But his eyes were bright with something that looked remarkably like joy, and he was smiling despite his obvious exhaustion. "Eddie," Greta whispered, unable to process what she was seeing. "You came back?" "I came back," he confirmed, closing the distance between them with halting steps. "I'm sorry it took so long. I had to figure out how to do it without." He paused, clearly searching for German words he didn't know, then gave up and just said, without getting in trouble, "But I'm here now, and I brought food and water and—" He stopped again, this time because Hans had launched himself at Eddie's legs, wrapping his thin arms around the soldier's knees and sobbing with relief so profound it shook his entire frame. "You came back," Hans kept repeating in German. "You came back, you came back, you actually came back." Eddie dropped to his knees, setting down his burdens and gathering the boy into his arms with a gentleness that made Greta's throat close with emotion. "Of course I came back," he said, switching between English and broken German. "Did you think I would forget you? Did you think I would just leave and never wonder how you were doing?" "Mama said you wouldn't come back," Maria piped up, her voice small but clear. "She said soldiers always leave and never come back. She said we shouldn't be sad because that's just how the world works." "Well, your mama was wrong this time," Eddie said gently, looking up at Greta with eyes that held understanding and forgiveness for her cynicism. "I'm a soldier, yes, but I'm also a human being. And human beings keep their promises when they can, even if it takes a while to figure out how." Other American soldiers had begun gathering at the checkpoint, watching this reunion with varying expressions of confusion and interest. Sergeant Martinez was there, Greta noticed, and his face split into a wide grin when he recognized them. "Well, I'll be damned," Martinez said. "Kowalski, you crazy son of a bitch, you actually did it. You actually came back for them." Eddie stood, keeping one hand on Hans's shoulder, as if afraid the boy might vanish if he let go. He reached into his backpack and started pulling out supplies, rations and water bottles and a small medical kit. "For Dr. Patterson," he explained. "For Maria's cough." I remembered she was sick, and I thought... He trailed off, then just pushed the supplies into Greta's hands. "These are for you, all of it. And there's more coming because I called in about 50 different favors and pissed off at least a dozen people. But I don't care anymore because some things are more important than regulations." Lieutenant Blake chose that moment to emerge from the command tent, his face darkening with fury as he took in the scene. "Kowalski! What the hell do you think you're doing? You're not even assigned to this sector anymore." Eddie stood up straight, meeting Blake's gaze with quiet defiance. "I'm doing what should have been done in the first place, sir. I'm helping people who need help. Civilians, non-combatants, children who are starving because we decided regulations were more important than their lives." Blake's jaw tightened. "You're out of line, Private. This is insubordination, possible desertion, definitely misappropriation of military supplies. I could have you court-martialed for this." "Then do it, sir," Eddie replied calmly. "Court-martial me. Write me up. Do whatever you think you need to do. But first, read this." He pulled a folded letter from his jacket pocket, the one his grandmother had written, and held it out to Blake. "It's from my grandmother," he explained. "She's a Polish immigrant who was saved by a German family during the pogroms. They fed her when she was starving. They hid her when soldiers came looking. They risked their lives because they believed that some things, like feeding hungry children, matter more than politics or nationality or what your commanding officers tell you is allowed. Blake took the letter with obvious reluctance, his eyes scanning the shaky handwriting while the gathered soldiers watched in silence. Greta could see his expression shift as he read, could see the exact moment when the words began to penetrate his armor of regulations and proper military procedure. When Blake finally looked up, his face had lost some of its rigid anger. He looked tired suddenly, older, like a man confronting truths he'd been trying to avoid. "Your grandmother," he said slowly, "wrote that feeding these children is an act of resistance." "Resistance to what?" "To hatred, sir," Eddie replied quietly. "To the idea that following orders is more important than being decent human beings. To the notion that we can defeat evil by becoming heartless ourselves." Blake was silent for a long moment, the letter still in his hands, his internal struggle visible in the tightness around his eyes and mouth. Finally, he handed the letter back to Eddie and said, "I have a son, back home in Georgia. He's about this boy's age." He gestured toward Hans, who was watching the exchange with wide eyes, clearly understanding that something important was being decided even if he didn't follow all the English words. "If my son was starving in a ruined city," Blake continued slowly, "and enemy soldiers had the power to feed him, I would want them to choose mercy over regulations. I would want them to see him as a child first and an enemy second." He paused, then added, "Maybe I've been wrong about what proper discipline looks like in situations like this." The gathered soldiers released a collective breath, the tension that had been building suddenly diffusing. Martinez stepped forward, his face carefully neutral. "Sir, if I might make a suggestion? We've got surplus rations from the last supply drop, more than we need for our current unit size. Seems a shame to let good food go to waste when there are hungry civilians in the area. For humanitarian purposes, of course. Completely by the book." Blake's lips twitched, almost forming a smile. By the book. Of course. He looked at Eddie, then at Greta and her children, then back at Eddie. "Kowalski, you're still insubordinate and reckless and a pain in my ass. But you're also right. We're the United States Army. We're supposed to be the good guys. Hard to make that claim if we're letting kids starve." He turned to address the assembled soldiers. "Effective immediately, we're establishing a civilian aid program for non-combatant Germans in this sector. Food distribution, basic medical care, whatever we can spare. Sergeant Martinez will coordinate the logistics. Any man who has a problem with this can take it up with me directly." No one moved to object. In fact, several soldiers were already reaching for their own supplies, offering rations and water and clothing they could spare. The wall that Blake had tried to build between soldiers and civilians was crumbling, brought down not by force, but by the simple human inability to ignore suffering when you had the power to alleviate it. Eddie helped Greta and her children back to the cellar, carrying supplies that would last them for weeks. As he set down the last box of rations, Hans tugged on his sleeve. "Mr. Eddie, will you stay this time, or will you have to leave again?" Eddie looked at the boy, at the hope and fear warring in his expression, and made a promise he wasn't entirely sure he could keep, but that he knew was necessary anyway. "I'll stay as long as I can, Hans. And when I do have to leave, it'll be because the war is over and we're all going home. Not because someone decided you weren't worth helping." "Mama was wrong then," Maria said matter-of-factly. "Soldiers don't always leave. Some of them keep their promises." Greta felt tears streaming down her face, hot and unchecked, the first real tears she'd allowed herself since Johann's death. These weren't tears of grief or despair, but something more complicated, relief and gratitude, and the tentative rebirth of hope that had been dead for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like. "Thank you," she said to Eddie in English, the words inadequate but the only ones she had. "Thank you for coming back, for remembering us." "For?" She couldn't finish, couldn't find words in English or German for what he'd given them. It wasn't just food or safety or the promise of continued support. It was the restoration of her faith that human beings could choose kindness over convenience, could see past uniforms and flags and all the artificial divisions that separated them, could recognize shared humanity even in the midst of war. "My grandmother always said," Eddie replied, "that the most important thing we can do is remember we're human beings first. Everything else, American, German, soldier, civilian, all of that comes second. You would have done the same for my family if the situation was reversed." "I hope so," Greta said. "I hope I would have been brave enough. But I don't know. I wasn't brave enough before. When my neighbors needed help, I did nothing." "You're doing something now," Eddie pointed out. "You're surviving. You're keeping your children alive. You're accepting help when it's offered, even though pride probably tells you to refuse. That's brave in its own way." Over the following weeks, the relationship between the American soldiers and the German civilians evolved from charity into something more like community. Children began appearing from other cellars and bombed-out buildings, drawn by the smell of cooking food and the rumor that the Americans were safe, that they shared their rations and didn't hurt people, and sometimes even smiled. Doc Patterson set up an informal medical clinic, treating infections and malnutrition and the countless small injuries that accumulated when you lived in rubble. Martinez organized a distribution system that ensured every known family in the area received regular rations. Johnson started teaching English lessons to a growing class of German children who saw language skills as their ticket to a better future. Even Flynn, cynical Flynn who trusted no one, could be found most evenings playing makeshift soccer with a crowd of kids using a ball someone had constructed from rags and string. Hans flourished in this environment, his natural cheerfulness reasserting itself as regular meals restored his health and the absence of immediate danger allowed childhood to re-emerge. He became a sort of liaison between the Americans and other German civilians, his bilingual skills and natural friendliness making him perfect for the role. He would accompany soldiers on supply runs, introducing them to families who were still hiding, still afraid, still uncertain whether surrender meant safety or imprisonment. Maria started going to Johnson's English lessons, soaking up the language with the speed of the very young. Within a month, she could hold simple conversations, her vocabulary expanding daily as she practiced with any soldier patient enough to listen. She still clutched her wooden doll, but now Anna served as a teaching tool rather than a security blanket, with Maria explaining things to Anna in English to reinforce her own learning. Greta found herself becoming invaluable as the Americans tried to navigate the complex social landscape of occupied Germany. She could identify which civilians had been true believers in the regime and which had been coerced into compliance. She could explain cultural nuances that helped prevent misunderstandings. She could translate not just words but meanings, helping both sides understand each other in ways that went deeper than language. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, the town began to come back to life. Not as it had been before, that was impossible. Too much had been destroyed and too many people had died for any return to the past. But something new was growing in the ruins, something built on shared survival and mutual recognition of humanity. Something that suggested maybe the future didn't have to be defined solely by the hatred of the past. Eddie wrote to his grandmother regularly, describing this small miracle they were building in the rubble. Her responses were jubilant, filled with pride and encouragement, and the occasional sharp reminder that what they were doing mattered precisely because it was difficult, because it required choosing compassion over convenience every single day. "This is how we make the world better," she wrote in one letter. "Not through grand gestures or dramatic sacrifices, but through small, consistent choices to treat other human beings with dignity and kindness. Feed them, Eddie. Keep feeding them. Keep showing them that not all soldiers are monsters, that not all Americans are enemies, that there are people in the world who believe that children should never go hungry regardless of what flag flies over their heads." One evening in late May, as the days grew longer and the weather warmed enough to make outdoor fires comfortable, Martinez organized what he called a community dinner. Every American soldier contributed something from their rations, and the German families brought whatever they could spare: potatoes salvaged from bombed gardens, wild greens picked from the rubble, even a chicken someone had managed to keep alive through the worst of the fighting. They ate together in the town square, or what used to be the town square before the bombing. Americans and Germans, former enemies, sharing food and stories and tentative friendship. Hans sat between Eddie and Private Johnson, translating their jokes for the benefit of the other German children. Maria sang a German lullaby that her father had taught her, and when she finished, Doc Patterson sang an American folk song in return. Greta found herself laughing, actual, genuine laughter, for the first time since Johann's death. Lieutenant Blake, who'd become increasingly supportive of their civilian aid program once he'd allowed himself to see the people they were helping as individuals rather than statistics, made a short speech. His German was terrible, full of grammatical errors and questionable pronunciation, but the message came through clearly enough. "We came here as conquerors," he said haltingly, working from a translation Martinez had helped him prepare. "We thought we understood what victory meant. Defeat the enemy, impose our will, ensure they could never threaten us again. But we were wrong about what victory looks like. Real victory isn't about domination. It's about building something better from the ruins of what was destroyed. It's about choosing to be human beings together rather than enemies forever." The German civilians listened with expressions ranging from skepticism to hope, still uncertain whether this American kindness would last or would evaporate once the occupation ended and new orders came from new commanders. But they clapped when Blake finished, a hesitant, scattered applause that grew stronger as more people joined in. And for a moment it felt possible that the cycles of hatred and retribution might actually be broken, that this generation might choose differently than all the generations that had come before. That night, as Eddie walked Greta and her children back to their cellar, she said quietly, "I think Johann would have liked you. He would have approved of what you're doing here." "Tell me about him," Eddie requested. "What was he like?" So Greta told him, describing the gentle schoolteacher who'd loved books and children and had been horrified when he'd been conscripted, who'd written letters home describing the senseless brutality of the Eastern Front, who'd tried to desert not because he was a coward, but because he couldn't reconcile his conscience with the orders he was being given, who'd been shot by his own officers for that choice, labelled a traitor and a disgrace, his family left with nothing but shame and a widow's pension that had evaporated once the American advance began. "He sounds like a good man," Eddie said when she finished. "He was," Greta confirmed. "He would have hated everything that was done in our country's name. He would have been ashamed of what we became. But he would have loved seeing this, seeing Americans and Germans choosing to be kind to each other, choosing to feed children instead of making them pay for their parents' mistakes." They reached the cellar, and Hans immediately ran inside to put away the extra rations they'd received at the dinner. Maria followed more slowly, clutching Anna and humming the American folk song Doc Patterson had taught her. Greta turned to Eddie, her face serious in the dim evening light. "I need to tell you something. When you first left, when Lieutenant Blake forbade contact with us, I thought you had abandoned us. I thought you were like all the other soldiers who make promises they don't keep, who show kindness until it becomes inconvenient. I was wrong. I'm sorry I doubted you." "You weren't wrong to doubt," Eddie replied. "You were protecting yourself and your children the only way you knew how. After everything you've been through, trust isn't something you give easily. It has to be earned. I'm just glad I got the chance to earn it." "You did more than that," Greta said. "You showed us that not everyone is what the propaganda said they were. That Americans aren't monsters. That maybe, just maybe, there are people in the world who still believe in being kind, even when it's difficult, even when it's forbidden, even when it would be easier to walk away." "My grandmother believes," Eddie said, "that how we treat the most vulnerable people during the worst times defines who we really are. Not how we act when it's easy, but how we act when it's hard. You and your children, you're teaching me what that means. You're teaching all of us." As the summer progressed, the small town that had been destroyed by war slowly transformed into something new. Not a return to what had been, that was impossible. Too much had been lost. But a reimagining of what could be, a community built on the ashes of hatred with the unlikely foundation of former enemies choosing humanity over history. More civilians emerged from hiding, encouraged by the reports of American kindness filtering through the grapevine. More children appeared in Johnson's English classes. More families began the slow, painful work of rebuilding, not just their homes, but their lives and their hopes for a future that might be different from the past. And through it all, Eddie kept his promise. He stayed, he helped, he showed up day after day, teaching Hans how to play baseball, helping Martinez with supply distribution, learning German words from Greta while teaching her English in return, reminding everyone through his consistent presence that some promises, the important ones, were meant to be kept regardless of the obstacles. On the morning of May 8th, when news arrived that the war in Europe had officially ended, that Germany had surrendered unconditionally, that the fighting was finally over, the reaction in their little community was complex. Relief, certainly, that the killing had stopped, but also uncertainty about what came next, about what peace would mean for Germans under Allied occupation, about whether the kindness they'd experienced from these particular American soldiers would translate into policy at higher levels of command. Blake called a community meeting in the town square, and this time his German was better, improved by weeks of practice and determination to communicate clearly. "The war is over," he told the assembled civilians. "What that means for you, for all of us, I can't say with certainty. New orders will come, new commanders will make decisions about occupation policy and reconstruction efforts. But I can promise you this, as long as I'm in charge of this sector, no one will go hungry. No child will be denied medical care. No family will be punished for the crimes of leaders they never supported." He paused, looking around at the faces, at the mixture of Germans and Americans who'd become something more than occupiers and occupied, something that approached genuine community. "We can't change what happened," Blake continued. "We can't bring back the people who died or undo the destruction or erase the memories of these terrible years. But we can choose what we build from the ruins. We can choose to remember our shared humanity rather than our enforced divisions. We can choose, every single day, to be better than the hatred that brought us here." The applause this time was immediate and sustained, and Greta realized she was crying again. These ridiculous tears that seemed to come so easily now after years of forced stoicism. Hans was pressed against her side, Maria in her arms, and Eddie stood nearby with his hand on Hans's shoulder, and for the first time since Johann's death, Greta allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, her children might actually have a future worth living. That evening, as the sun set over the ruins and turned the rubble into gold, Greta sat with Eddie on the steps of what used to be the town hall and watched their children play. Hans and Maria, joined now by a dozen other German children and several young American soldiers, playing some complicated game that involved running and shouting and laughter, that rang through the streets like music, like hope made audible, like the sound of a world learning to be human again. "Thank you," she said to Eddie, not for the first time, and certainly not for the last, for coming back, for keeping your promise, for teaching my children that not all soldiers are monsters, that not all Americans are enemies, that there are people in the world who choose kindness when they could choose convenience." "Thank you for letting me help," Eddie replied, "for trusting me eventually, for showing me that the people we're taught to hate are just people after all, trying to survive, trying to protect their children, trying to hold on to their humanity in the midst of inhumanity." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the children play, listening to their laughter. Then Greta said quietly, "What happens next? When you have to leave? When all the American soldiers go home?" "I don't know," Eddie admitted. "I hope the kindness continues. I hope the policies from above match what we've tried to build here. I hope someone remembers that feeding hungry children and treating people with dignity should never be considered controversial or a violation of regulations." He paused, then added, "But even if everything changes, even if new commanders come in with different ideas about how occupation should work, we'll have proven something important. We'll have proven that it's possible, that enemies can become friends, that hatred can be overcome with consistent small acts of compassion. That's worth something, isn't it? That knowledge, that proof." "Yes," Greta agreed. "That's worth everything." In the distance, they could hear Hans teaching one of the American soldiers a German song, his voice clear and confident in a way that would have been unimaginable just a few months earlier. They could hear Maria's bright laughter as she played with other children who remembered her from before the war, when she'd been loud and boisterous instead of whispery and afraid. They could hear Doc Patterson telling jokes that probably weren't funny, but that everyone laughed at anyway because laughter itself had become precious, a commodity worth more than gold in these ruins where joy had been so scarce for so long. And sitting there in the golden evening light, watching their communities, these unlikely family built from the rubble of hatred and destruction, Greta understood something that would stay with her for the rest of her life. The surprise hadn't been that Americans could be kind. The surprise was that human beings, regardless of their uniforms or languages or the flags they served, could plant seeds of compassion in soil poisoned by years of hatred. And if they tended those seeds carefully enough, with enough consistency and enough stubborn refusal to let regulations override conscience, something beautiful could grow.